and we will be doing three things. First, a few comments about serving God, serving the church as a pianist, and then secondly, how to play a hymn, and then thirdly, how to improvise a hymn. First of all, then, the pianist as a servant leader in the church. Just because someone has classical music training doesn't make him or her a good church pianist necessarily. In fact, sometimes our classical training limits us from being effective in playing the piano at church. On the other end, there are people who play by ear, who never had one day of piano lessons, and they have a lot of experience in contemporary worship music or just contemporary popular music. That is good that they have a sense of music. However, more is needed as well in order to be an effective church pianist. You see, a church pianist leads God's people in singing, and in my opinion, a church pianist also follows God's people, and at the end of the day, he or she serves God's people. For example, sometimes God's people make the same mistake over and over again in singing a particular hymn. Now, my policy is to, as much as possible, go along with that particular mistake unless it is really out of hand. Or maybe it's not a mistake, but it's a particular way of singing. Let me give you an example. Let's say the Christmas hymn, Joy to the World. How long do you pause? And Martin Luther's hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. How long do you pause at the end of each phrase? Now, I have my own way, my own opinion, but when it comes to actually playing for concrete congregations, I will try to follow along without disrupting the flow of the singing. Sometimes the mistake is so obvious that I can only play the correct original version and just allow them to make the mistake. The most typical example is, and can it be that I should gain? I will play the wrong way and then the right way for the first two phrases. case of And Can It Be That I Should Gain, I try to pound out that C and that D flat. Da, 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 da. Although I well know that the majority of Christians will not hear what I was playing and will continue to sing da, 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 da. I hope that 10 years from now, maybe 10 or 20 more people will realize that they should sing da, 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 da. But during a worship service, it is not the time to correct them in these things. A pianist leads and follows. So I'm listening to the congregation sing while I'm trying to lead them along. For example, how long do you pause? Well, after I set a tempo and have my own phrasing, then many people know about how long that I am going to pause, and so they tend to follow along. 4. A pianist does use his or her music training for the sake of effective worship, for the sake of worship that is according to the Holy Spirit and in truth. Therefore, every church musician, including pianists and worship leaders, must know the Old Testament well and be familiar with the time-tested forms of worship music. This is not the place for me to give you an Old Testament survey of music and the lyrics of the Psalms, but whether we are an instrumentalist or a vocalist or conductor, we must be familiar with the theology of the Old Testament. God's attributes, God's promises, and God's acts of creation and acts in redemption. A pianist can edify and bless God's people. I'm convinced that we can convey our faith, our devotion to the Lord Jesus by the way we play, using techniques such as phrasing and expression and keeping good rhythm or good time. I am now going to share with you how to play a hymn. First of all, the issue really is, how do you practice any piece? How do you practice any music as a piano player? Well, here I'm indebted to one of my most important piano teachers in my life from 1965 to 67. I studied under this African-American man, Richard Johnson, in Aurora, Illinois, and he studied under his teacher, Arnold Schultz of Chicago. And so I spent 2 years under Mr. Johnson, who then took me to his teacher, Mr. Schultz, for the summer of 1967. So everything I'm going to tell you comes from what I learned during those 2 very crucial years in high school outside Chicago. The goal of playing is to really know what the composer wrote and to play faithfully what the composer wrote. Now, of course, we're going to go on and talk about improvisation, but improvisation, changing, adding, embellishing, is built on the foundation that you know the original music. I will now play a few phrases from classical music and a few phrases from hymns. We must know every note that was written and to be able to play those notes with the correct fingering. A little bit of Bach and a couple of hymns. music for Great is Thy Faithfulness and What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So I'm sure I made some mistakes there already. But I try my very best to play according to the music. So how do you learn a piece of music? The first step is to read the music. To read the music. Now let us go back to Bach Prelude number 1 in C major, and we need to read the music, both the left hand and the right hand, and you are not allowed to move your fingers, not even on your lap. My teacher required me to read the music, let's say 1 bar, or probably less than that, probably half a bar, half a measure. You look at the music, you look at the keyboard. You look at the music again, you look at the keyboard again. You go up and down until the point where you can visualize your own fingers playing those notes with the correct fingering. So the first thing you do is read the music, read the keyboard, read the music, read the keyboard. What you're doing is you are creating a video, a movie of your fingers playing those notes. After you've done that, probably back and forth about 10 to 20 times, then your brain says, fingers, play what you saw. What you have been seeing, now play. Now when you play, you're not allowed to look at the music. When you look at the music, you're not allowed to play or even move your fingers. But when you play, you do not look at the music. So you're not memorizing a written score. What you're memorizing is the act of your fingers playing before you actually do it. Let me demonstrate. Even though we don't have a piece of music in front of me, I will pretend that I'm looking at the music and looking at the keyboard, and then finally play what I saw. What I was doing was to show you how to play the first 2 measures of What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Actually, you probably would have read the music more times than just 2 or 3, more likely 5 to 10 times before you can play half a measure. Da, da. The second half, da, 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 da. And then the next bar, da, da. So the first step is to read the music. The second step is to imagine or visualize the music. The third step is play what you see. Then, what if I make a mistake? You see, this way of playing the piano ensures and guarantees that you either know the music or you don't know it. The common mistake is in learning how to play the piano is you look at the keyboard and you just fumble around with your fingers from the beginning, and when you make a mistake, you go back to the beginning again. Now this common method of playing the piano almost guarantees that you know the music half well forever and ever for the rest of your life. And so that you're very much afraid when performing in public, when you make a mistake, you will then go back to the beginning or you are helpless. We will now show you how that will not happen. How you will not just learn something half well or half baked, but you know it well. Well, what if you make a mistake, especially during your practice or when you are meeting with your piano teacher? What you do is you stop exactly where you make a mistake, and then you do the same thing over again. Read the music, look at the keyboard, read the music, look at the keyboard, at the point of the mistake. Let's say it's 2 chords. Then, after you correct those 2, expand it to 4. So that it is almost like you're putting a bandage, a band-aid, a scotch tape over the mistake by relearning that little bit and then a little bit more. Let me show you how. How we correct our mistakes at the point when we're practicing. Now, many piano students and many piano players consider this method very boring. I will guarantee you that this is the most time-saving, the quickest way of learning any piece. Instead, what the rest of the world tends to do is to play a piece of music from the beginning over and over and over again, half-baked. The result is you get very bored of the piece very quickly. In fact, my teacher taught me to learn a piece not necessarily from the beginning. You can start in the middle of the piece, the second half, start at the end, so that you are learning 2 bars here, 2 bars there, 2 bars there, and then you put them together, because every bar, every 2 bars is learned well. And then you put a scotch tape, a bandage, between the 2 bars and 2 bars, and then you piece it together. If you practice 2 hours a day, in 1 week, you will learn probably half a short piece well. In 2 weeks, you will have mastered the piece. Instead of fumbling along, looking at the music half-consciously. Everything is proactive. You already know what it sounds like. Sorry, you already know what it looks like. Therefore, what it should sound like. It's a little bit similar to some of the conductors of orchestras who already know what the music sounds like, and he is ahead of the orchestra. Training your fingertips. What I have been demonstrating so far is to play the music faithfully by imagining it before you play it. Now I will show you what my teacher required me to do, and that is to use the least amount of energy to play what you have imagined after you read the music. We'll use What a Friend We Have in Jesus again. Play it with as little energy as possible, and then do not pull your fingers up. Gravity would take care of itself if you just stop supplying energy. It will sound very wooden and very soft. What we're doing at this point is training your fingertips, the nerve endings at your fingertips, in determining its relationship with the key itself. If you do this consistently, let's say What a Friend We Have in Jesus there, the first phrase, which is 2 measures, you need to repeat that process at least 10 times. And then you move on to the next measure or 2 measures and do it at least 10 times. Better yet, 15 times, 20 times. So at the end of 30 minutes or 45 minutes, you have learned that line completely. In 2 hours, you have learned that hymn for the rest of your life. This is how I learned Chopin's Scherzo in B-flat minor in the summer of 1967. Today is September 11, 2011. So that was 34 years ago that I learned this. I can no longer play it with a proper technique, but I can still play it in a practice form for you. It's something like this. I will speed up a little bit instead of using the practice speed to show you that once you learn it visually, you've got it. 34 years ago and 2 months. 34 and 2 years and 2 months ago, I learned the following. But those notes have been ingrained visually in my mind for 34 years. And I have not lost, I think I probably lost about 10 of those notes on that page, which is the 3rd page of Scherzo in B-flat minor. So correct yourself, train your fingertips. Now finally, where does your strength come from? Now, I was trained to use my fingertips to play very woodenly, very softly, and then you supply your strength from the lower back. The fingers are like the mouse. Now, A mouse was the word my teacher used in 1965, long before the PC computer came out. And what he meant was that it is only the executor, the only implementer. The wrist is the fulcrum. The wrist is a turning point where energy is channeled. So we keep the wrist firm, but not stiff. Not soft, firm, but not stiff. And only in exceptional cases do we make it a little bit stiffer. We use our shoulders, we sit back and allow the back to supply the strength to the arm, and through the wrist as the fulcrum, supply the fingers with energy. I will play the first few bars of Sketch to show you how that is done. Actually, I will first show you how it is done when you play softly, and then how do you add strength. It is not by pounding with more strength with the fingers. It is simply the whole back giving the hand the strength it needs. There is nothing magical about playing softly and beautifully and powerfully and with great strength. Your back supplies as much energy as your hand needs, as your fingers need, and the wrist serves as the fulcrum where the strength is channeled. Now, we must know our scales and our arpeggios if we're going to improvise hymns. I will play a few scales and arpeggios for you. I am completely out of touch in this year to 2011, but I will remember what I learned before meeting Mr. Johnson in Hong Kong, taking the 8th grade Royal Conservatory exams. Scales, arpeggios, Hanon, and Czerny. No substitute for those. Then you can improvise the hymns. Now let's get to playing a hymn. Let's say we know what the music says. Now, we need to train our fourth and fifth fingers on the right hand because the melody, the theme is everything. Imagine you're going to play the melody of the hymn, melody or the theme of the hymn about 100 times the volume, 100 times louder than the alto part, the tenor part, the bass part. I said 100 times because if you try to do it 100 times louder, you end up playing about 5 or 10 times louder, which is just about right. I will play a few hymns to demonstrate. The melody is everything. And the second most important thing is the bass line. This means that your alto and tenor part, the fingers that play the alto and the tenor parts, will go down to the keyboard at a different time. You will see, because I'm also going to make the melody sometimes delayed a little bit. Different strength, almost different time of arrival. The melody is everything. You are making a statement. You are making a profession or confession of faith. You are saying something. You are giving a message. melody and the theme is everything. Now, point number 11, we need to get into good practice of listening and playing good time-tested music. Bach, Handel, Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, Schubert, and so on, and some sonatas if possible. But playing Bach regularly can never hurt you. It's like taking vitamins. And you can probably tell from my playing that I like Chopin a lot, and it shows in my improvisation. So playing a hymn, read the music, imagine the music, correct your mistakes, always know exactly the notes and the correct fingering. This is not a workshop on fingering, but you will need to figure out the correct fingering before you touch the keyboard for the first time with that music. We will now move on to improvising a hymn. The first thing we must learn how to do, we covered in our last section, it is to play the hymn exactly as it is written, emphasizing the melody. We will now move on to the second step. We call this the choral way of playing. And what we do is we put the tenor part, which usually is played on the left hand, into the right hand. But you might complain and say, well, the tenor part is more than an octave lower than the soprano part. But that's all right. You move it up one octave so that it's very near the soprano part. Then for the left hand, you play the bass octave. Let me demonstrate. If you know the piece already, every note of it with the correct fingering. The next step is to learn the congregational way of playing a hymn. And again, it is very easy if you know the hymn. In the congregational method, you play the melody as an octave, and you play the bass as an octave. And you stuff the right hand, the middle fingers, with the alto and the tenor parts. Remember, the melody is everything. The bass is the second most important. So the alto and the tenor part, they do not disappear, but they are there in between the melody and its octave below. Congregational playing. If you don't learn anything else, just learn how to play the hymn correctly as it is written, emphasize the melody, and put the soprano and the bass as an octave. Move the tenor up, and that should serve you very well for many years. Remember, the energy comes from the back, flows down the arms, make your wrist the fulcrum, and let the fingers do the mouse work. Your first goal probably is during the first month, learn how to play a hymn correctly. If you have the discipline and concentration, take a very familiar hymn and relearn it as if you never knew it before. Then play it chorally and congregationally. Now we're going to talk about what do you do with your left hand if everything is on the right hand and now you want to make it interesting and alive. Let me first tell you what not to do. You do not run an arpeggio completely below middle C. Not everything is just like the Maiden's Prayer. Learn from Chopin how he skips around below the middle C. I will do it wrongly, and then I'll show you how to do it correctly. sometimes you can put the melody under the middle C and use your thumb to play the melody. Now that means you need to know your arpeggios very well, and some hymns are easily lent for doing that, others are not so easy to do. I will choose one that is very easy, relatively speaking, to put the melody a little bit lower than the middle C. My Jesus, I love you. Sometimes you can run an arpeggio on the left hand. Make sure your melody and the chord is in control on your right hand, then jump 1 octave higher or come back to its original position. Remember, everything under middle C, if it's an arpeggio or chord, must be played very softly. And the melody is everything. Let me repeat. You can move the melody octave chord up and down, but always the melody is everything. Sometimes you can just play the bass note or run a chord, but if you're running a chord on the left hand, always play it softly.